Looking forward to our next presenter from right here at Texas A&M. We have Dr. Garett Sansom, who is a health and environment lead for the Institute for Sustainable Communities and an assistant professor at the Texas A&M School of Public Health. That's where I spent almost 18 years. And so very glad to have him here. His professional interests revolve around the human health implications of the environment, urban planning, and the impact of natural hazards. In addition to publishing widely and in, not wildly, but widely in academic journals, his work also includes nature conservation pieces, and he's a primary author on the Texas Outdoor Recreation Plan, where he wrote, if you want to go look, the 7th chapter entitled The Value of Parks and Recreation in Physical, Mental, and Social Well-Being. Please help me welcome Dr. Sansom.
Well, thank you. You know, I wish I had published wildly and not just widely. So I'm an environmental epidemiologist. We've kind of been hearing about the benefits of green space and access to nature. I'm going to kind of take a shift a little bit and talk about some of the negative health implications when you don't have access to those sort of thing, but also have a little bit of a path forward. Unfortunately, for a long time, I've only been able to identify negative issues, you know, poor health conditions, issues with pollution, and then I just kind of disappear because I don't have an answer to it. But we've been working pretty hard with several different centers and institutes to be able to come up with like what is a plan for that's actually reasonable and can happen. Also, apparently I have an issue with really overly long titles, so I apologize for that. I was told after I submitted, like, you know, really want like 3 or 4 words, right? And so I did a whole sentence. But for those of you who aren't aware, in just a tiny bit of background, the previous speaker sort of talked about what environmental justice a little bit. If you're unfamiliar with that term, it's just the reality that low-income, vulnerable, minority, majority communities typically shoulder an undue burden to urban pollution, environmental conditions, and lack of green space. The data on this is now pretty conclusive and has been showing throughout the entirety of the United States. So what I'm gonna do today is not to pick on Houston. I just do a lot of work in Houston. I feel like if we can get it right in Houston for some reasons I'm gonna talk about, then we can use those, what we learned from that, to really be able to push through much of the United States. Because I think it's just an interesting case study. I'm going to try to do my best to sort of set the stage for why that is, talk a little bit about the research that we've been doing, and then hopefully a path forward that makes sense to serve all Texans. So Houston's a fascinating place. I don't know how many folks are from that area, but the Houston Ship Channel is one of the busiest seaports in the world. There's anywhere between 50 to 100 and sometimes up to 250 or even 300 ships daily that come in and out of the Houston Ship Channel. So it's an active location, and it's one of the biggest powerhouses for economic growth. I gave a presentation in Europe, and somebody made some kind of comment about the greater Houston area. Well, the greater Houston area, and this includes like the entirety of the Ship Channel and also Galveston area, if it was its own country, it'd have about the 25th largest GDP in the world. So there's a tremendous amount of economic growth, energy production. There's a little over 5,000 energy businesses that operate within that region. So it can't be overstated about the potential, the efforts, right, and then the economic growth that you experience from this type of area. And that's also true even when you're talking about individuals. You don't need to read this necessarily, but suffice it to say, individuals can make more money in Houston doing any energy production than anywhere else in the world. Sometimes double, and in fact, and even more so, right? So it's an area in which a lot of people really can get good jobs that can support all kinds of efforts. In fact, there's been a new effort in a lot of the Houston Ship Channel communities, these, again, environmental justice communities, to try to recruit more within the actual community itself to have a pipeline to more jobs. So what do we have? We've got an area, the energy, potentially energy capital of the world, one of the busiest seaports, a tremendous amount of wealth, opportunities for jobs, well-paying jobs for a lot of people. Not all of them require advanced educations. Some do require you have a college degree, but not all of them. But with that, you do have an area that has a lot of unique interest, a lot of unique experiences. So Houston is sort of at the nexus of exposure for background pollution levels, issues with urban planning, but also natural anthropogenic disasters. So there's been a few instances now, the most recent would be Hurricane Harvey, in which we've had a hurricane go right on up the Houston Ship Channel and then just kind of park itself and then move around. And what we're finding is in these locations, we're having these cascading events in which a natural phenomenon like a hurricane has its own issues with flooding. The flooding then causes power outages, and then the power outages cause everything from chemical fires to petrochemical fires and issues associated with that. I think during Hurricane Harvey, the Arkema plant was one of the most serious, in which the power went out. Everything was okay because they had a backup generator, and then the backup generator flooded. They said, well, listen, we got volatile organics in there and it's going to explode, right? And it did. And there was a real serious fire. And so then we have a flooding event that is now also a serious risk for inhalation exposure. We also have experienced things like the ITC petrochemical fire, in which for about 4 or 5 days, there was a 4,000-foot plume that went over Houston. So we have these chronic flooding issues. We do have pollution events. We have issues with equity on who's experiencing these types of exposures. And so it presents an opportunity for potentially poor health outcomes. Also, for instance, the EPA has the toxic release inventory. If you're unfamiliar with it, just things that create, if you're a company that creates, stores, transports, or otherwise uses compounds that may be carcinogenic, or it's known to cause either environmental or individual or community health issues, you have to report it to the TRI facilities. And if you do spatial analytics, you find that the clustering of these are typically, again, in lower income minority majority communities that have the most amount of TRI facilities in their area. So when I was asked to give this presentation, and you're given 15, 20 minutes, I was like, all right, well, I need, how do I, it's impossible to be able to talk about what the issues are. But I think this graph kind of can do it a little bit. So so Houston's split up into 88 super neighborhoods. And we've operated thus far now in all 88 of them, some capacity. And we've done what's called, we've done a community health assessment using what's called a short form 12 health survey, or the SF12. The good thing about the SF12 is it's been validated to work with all populations, all groups, several languages throughout the United States. It's often utilized by health departments and research throughout the nation, and now moving into Mexico. What it does is it creates a general physical and mental health score. And this is normed. So it's every year they norm it to 50. So if you have a score of 50, you are, relatively speaking, in the average health of the country. Now, obviously, there's pluses and minuses on what does general health mean, what does general physical and mental health mean. However, it does a good job of being able to, without pinpointing specific outcomes, give an idea of what people are experiencing. So this particular one, what we did was, and this is for Houston Ship Channel communities, we found that the longer that they lived in the community, the lower their physical health scores became. Now you might be thinking, it's just the longer you live, some of the older you get too. But even after adjusting on age, race, ethnicity, behavioral things such as smoking and drinking, this remained. And so what we found was the people that were in the closest proximity, the people had the least amount of green space, the least amount of nature access, and the highest levels of exposure to TRI facilities in these industries typically had the lowest health outcomes. Now, this is bad news because these areas are large, like these communities, these cities that go up and down the Houston Ship Channel, such as Deer Park, Galena Park, and then all of the several of the 88 super neighborhoods. You know, it's impossible to be able to do a large scale change or buyout program or green spacing the whole thing. Just financially, it's not doable. And a lot of the research beforehand typically stops here and just saying, okay, we know we have an issue. We need to kind of find a path forward. But working with several different groups, we decided to do our best to pinpoint specifically where in which the negative health outcomes are really being driven. So what we did was we created just as an example, this is Galena Park, again on the Houston Ship Channel. We said, listen, what if we use a suitability analysis and try to find out specific areas, can we create a low, medium, and high risk zones within the neighborhood? So what does that mean? So it's things such as, do you report to the TCQ's facilities? Are you a TRI facility? Are you within a certain space within them, right? A certain distance? Do you experience nuisance flooding, right? So if there's a big flooding issue, does your home flood, right? Does your car flood? When we're working with a lot of individuals, that was one of the things that came up. It was outside of my experiences. Gosh, every time it rains a lot, we got to move our cars, right? Because it floods up to the top of it. And that's just sort of the experience. It's not just during Hurricane Harvey. This can happen during any kind of major rain event. Do you have, if we look at stationary air monitors, can we pull that information in there as well? So we're taking all of this data and then we're creating 3 different zones. And what we found was about 2 to 5% of the city itself was in these so-called high risk areas, right? And so even though Galena Park itself geographically isn't huge, we were able to split them into, again, these low, medium, and high risk areas. And the low risk is the majority of the locations once you take into account these natural hazard experiences, the environmental conditions, and then the existing environmental data and proximity to TRI and TCQ. So what do we find? Well, what we found was, and this is the somewhat, like if we're thinking about good news, again, it's hard to say good news when we're talking about negative health outcomes, but the good news was the high risk areas and to an extent the medium risk areas was really driving all of the health issues. And so when you look at like non-cancerous chronic conditions, which is everything from COPD, diabetes, asthma, right? So we have a list of the most common chronic conditions. We went out and surveyed the entire city. We tried to do a CASPR, which is a 2-stage cluster methodology developed by the CDC, in which you randomly assign 30 zones within the city, and then you try to get 7 random homes for a goal of 210. It's been shown to be a representative sample with only 210 individuals. So it's become kind of my favorite method when we're looking at neighborhoods or cities, because you don't have to recruit, 500-600 people. With just 210, you can get a representative sample. The only difference is when we modified it a little bit, so we had parity amongst the high, medium, and low risk zones. So when you're looking at non-cancerous chronic conditions, the medium and high risk areas compared to low risk areas were about a 2-fold higher increase. And this remained even after adjusting it on behavioral issues, again, smoking, drinking, but also sex and race, ethnicity, and age. And so, in fact, it even didn't attenuate, it actually went a little bit higher after the adjustments. And the same is true with cancer conditions, which is a little bit more concerning because we had, roughly a 50% increase in cancer risk in these much smaller high risk zones, again, compared to the medium or low risk zones. So why is this good news? The reason this is good news is because if you take into account the entire city, you seem like you've got an area with some really serious health issues. However, when you break it up into these other areas, really the areas driving it are between, 2 to 10%, depending on the location of the entirety of the city where you're finding these real risky areas. And so those can be the actual targets for improvement and be able to improve access in a way that's much more manageable compared to previous projects in the past. So we held a series of community events around like, what would you do if you could change your landscape? So we recruited 3 different high school groups and several different organizations. And we held, I don't know, like 6 or 7, it's all a blur now, of these meetings in which we would print out large maps of their neighborhood. They can anonymously circle things to make sure maybe our spatial analytics weren't capturing what was actually true in the community. We created an app so they can go out and take pictures of things, and then we go to our database. We'd have the XY coordinates as well as their, like, whatever their comments were, such as, it always floods here, or there's a pipe that's, always sticking out of here and something's coming out of it. Any kind of concerns that they had. It allowed us to sort of pinpoint what those locations were and what kind of issues they might be facing within there. So after we did that, we put together a comprehensive plan based on this community feedback, which took, about a year. And one thing we found was a bunch of the high school students wanted to remain engaged. So it wasn't just this one-time meeting or 6-time meeting, like just giving us like, okay, great, you're not leaving, right? And so what we did is we created a citizen science program. And so we now have, this is Fur High School. In Fur High School, we have a citizen science program going, but now we've expanded that to several areas, also in South Texas and Hayes County. In Hayes County, it's the first time we've done a citizen science group with grade school students, and it is a totally different game with grade school kids, right? You never know, like the difference in where they are emotionally, intellectually is night and day. So some of the kids are bored and other ones have no idea what you're talking about. So we're still trying to work out the approaches with grade school kids, but the high school programs have been wonderful. It's been a huge thing. And so what we'll do is we'll have 4 lectures followed by 4 field activities. And then the final one is they'll actually go out and collect real data for several times. And this could be everything from soil samples in areas that they're concerned about. It could be water samples. One of the things that we're doing currently in South Texas is they're sampling drinking fountains because the city was actually concerned that there might be an issue in McAllen. And so we're working with them on how to pull different faucets and stuff, like playgrounds and stuff to see if there's any issues with like heavy metal exposure. And that was totally driven by the citizen science. Like this is a program they wanted to do. And the good news is two interesting things have come out of this. One is just, well, I guess 3. One is very, it's a fulfilling thing. It's probably one of my favorite parts of the job now that I never thought I would do is the citizen science programs. But one is it's been creating Aggies, right? We've got some of these kids now who are deciding to come in A&M who otherwise never would. And then second, but still important, they're going to other universities also. So we're having options for kids who traditionally don't go to higher education are now saying, I can do this science stuff. This really isn't that complicated. I belong, right? So we're doing our best to create a sense of belonging. And I'll say this, the plans in which we put together have benefited greatly from their input. I mean, they're coming out on their Saturdays, right? They spend all day Saturdays for like months on end. I don't know if I would have done that. So what does it look like? Okay, so this, as an example, this is a 3-phase area. We've got an area that has chronic flooding issues. It has an issue with environmental justice issues. There's pollution issues, right? There's no green space. There's no access to being able to go outdoors. And so what we'll do is we'll create 3 different phases. So I developed this with somebody from landscape architecture and urban planning. And so what it means was, how do you change, again, the situation from one of poor health issues, right? To an area the opposite, an area that actually improves health outcomes. And how do you choose where to go? Well, we know now because we can target the areas that are the worst off, that would benefit the most of people moving out and then change it to green space. And if you phase it in like this, you can also do analytics on how much it costs, right? And then when they'll make their money back. Just part of the unfortunate reality, and I'm like this too, it's difficult to think 30, 40, 50 years down the road on when, okay, now we'll be making our money back and then some. But most of these do typically have a 30 to 100 year depending on which phase you do, buy-in before you begin economically making all the money back. But it is there, right? And if you're really forward thinking, if we really are thinking about our grandkids and our great grandkids, this is the type of efforts I think that would make the most sense, particularly in the areas that need it the most and the most vulnerable, have had the least amount of green access space for several different generations. So just as an example, this is just a subsection of the area that was the highest risk within, this is in Manchester, Harrisburg in Houston. And so you can see, and this is, again, based on feedback that the different citizen science group and our community partners gave us. It's everything from like, gosh, we need a restaurant here, we need a grocery store here, right? If you're living in a neighborhood and you don't have a hospital, if you don't have a school, if you don't have a grocery store, if you don't have any kind of transportation, you're losing your community, right? It ceases to become a community anymore, because all of the services you need financially go out of the community, right? So all of your money is going elsewhere. It's really difficult to live inside and build those relationships that I think are so important. So it's not just environmental issues, it's also kind of bringing together sort of those social issues, those services that people deserve, and that kind of efforts and how it works. Now you might be thinking, gosh, all right, so if we take the worst spots right, and we turn to a green spot, don't we just have, a polluted green space? Well, not really. And so the evidence now is strong that if you put in green solutions and parks, you actually reduce the overall exposures to all sorts of conditions, including things like heavy metal, nitrogen, bacterial growth. And so just as an example, this is by weight for the community. You can see a reduction in the pre-development versus the developed area based on models. We're currently putting together two projects. One is, so there's been limited empirical evidence showing that these models are true, but we have extensive environmental data now on many communities, such as polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons in soils, heavy metals in soils, air pollutants, right? And so what we're trying to do is, now that we have that data, actually implement these in small ways, right? So we just got funding to kind of put that together a little bit and then follow them forward for a couple of years to make sure these models hold true. And once that's complete, we want to build a actual program that cities can use and say, listen, if we change, this spot to this green space, if we change this to walkable, what kind of health outcomes can we expect in 30 years? Well, you can expect a reduction in cancer rates, like 1 in 10,000 over a lifetime, right? You're going to expect a reduction in obesity levels. You can expect a reduction in asthma attacks and hospitalizations. And the specifics in quantifying that number really is kind of the impetus over the next few years to be able to put that together so people can make smart decisions based on the areas they are and really target, a doable amount of space to make it green space, both to just because of all of the benefits we've already been hearing of, but also as a way to reduce specific type of urban pollution levels. And so having that, I think, is and doing these engagement efforts, I think, yes, I think there's evidence, strong evidence and growing evidence that improves health outcomes. I think even just 10 years ago, you really kind of had a hedge how you said that. And I don't think that's true anymore. I think the evidence is starting to become pretty overwhelming for the benefit. If you have a reduction in environmental pollutants, yeah, well, that links into health outcomes, but also links into equity and justice issues. If you have I think it's a vital aspect of this type of efforts is going into the areas that historically have had the biggest issues with it, right? And beginning to offer the improvements and the benefits in the communities that have had unjust exposures to these types of pollutants. And the big thing is, especially when you do community engaged research, it gives them what they want. One thing that kind of is a difficult challenge, the kind of work I do and research in general, is a lot of times you kind of come up on high and you've got this idea and then you finish a project and the community couldn't care less. It's like, okay, great. You found out, whatever. But if you actually work with the community long term and have them be part of developing and improving your project, when you're done, you give the community things that they're actually interested with, and then they can advocate on their own behalf, be able to kind of push for these positive changes, which is much more difficult if you're just a researcher doing research. It's doable, and the big thing is there actually now is some growing funding streams to be able to do this type of thing. There's been I think a new interest, and folks like yourself and centers like this to be able to actually go in and make it better, change it, protect it, improve it, both for people from all stages, right? Prevention, I mean, I'm focusing pretty much on prevention here, but all the way through recovery. I think I've never seen anything like it. And so I think there's a real opportunity. I also think there's a lot of mechanisms in place right now that we could be using. I don't know if anyone's familiar with what a supplemental environmental project is, but if you're a company and maybe you let too much of a specific contaminant out than you're supposed to, you can either be fined or you can do a SEP. And usually those are things like they're supposed to be sort of these green space things, but sometimes they're often underutilized. I mean, for instance, I was with a group, and not to name them or anything, but they put like a basketball court up behind their fence. I'm like, that's not an environmental project. And so there's all this money that they already have to spend. But I think a lot of these companies working together for these larger products to be able to improve it, that's one mechanism that already exists. Just if we utilize it a little bit better, I think kind of makes sense. Just to say that none of this was done in a vacuum. This is I'm one slice of the pie of everything that's been happening. I worked a lot with some local organizations like the Texas Environmental Justice Advocacy Services, the Texas A&M Superfund Center. Yeah, like I said, usually I'm working in the negative space, right? So Superfund Center is pollution, but I'm excited to move to more positive one. The Galveston Bay Foundation, and of course TCEQ. One thing I found is if you're doing this work, make sure you let TCQ know what you're doing so they find out about it from you, not in the newspaper. Just to say where we're moving now, so we just started the Together for a Better Tomorrow project. This is happening in South Texas on the border, targeting the colonias. Whereas Houston has issues of flooding, the colonias has issues of drought, and also agriculture, issues of pesticide exposure. And they're losing some of the natural beauty and the natural land that's down there. So I think it's a real opportunity to focus on groups that really need it and don't have a lot of the other city services they typically would expect. So we've just started. We have 3 community advisory board meetings, or community advisory boards. We have meetings once every quarter. And they're really starting to direct how we put this together and sort of what the efforts are we're going to be doing. And it's already changed quite a bit. It has a focus on water security, has a focus on making sure water is clean and safe. It's doing a health assessment. And now it's also growing into, again, the large citizen science projects. One thing I forgot to just to give kudos to A&M again, all the students who go through my program are now getting a citizen science certificate, right? So they actually get a certificate of completion. Right now what I'm trying to do is shake up. Well, it'd also be nice if they got a little bit of a scholarship, right? So that's going to be kind of the next thing I'm pushing for. We'll see if A&M could do it. I'm sorry, that's me without a beard, but this is after one of the trips that we did doing water quality and citizen science efforts. So that's it. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk today.